I woke to the relentless beeping of machines and the sharp antiseptic sting of a hospital room, my body a prison of pain wrapped in tubes and bandages, every breath dragging against fractured ribs, every blink reminding me I was alive when perhaps I should not have been. Weeks had blurred into months since the crash, since metal and glass folded around me like a coffin, and yet not once had my husband stepped into this sterile room to hold my hand, whisper comfort, or even deliver a flower. I lay abandoned, wondering if he was waiting for me to fade into silence. Then the door creaked open with the slow inevitability of fate, and in he walked, tall, smug, dressed in a tailored suit that did not belong to the man I once knew. But it was not just him. On his arm clung a young woman, elegant, glowing a perfume cloud that smothered the disinfectant air. My throat tightened as if the oxygen mask were strangling me. My lips parted to say his name, but he raised a hand first, a gesture of cruel finality. "This," he announced, "is my wife now." The words sliced deeper than any wound carved into my body, a declaration that I had been erased, replaced, discarded like yesterday's paper. I felt my pulse thunder in my ears, blood roaring louder than the machines. I wanted to scream, to rip the IV from my arm, but I froze because in that instant the young woman turned her face fully toward me. Her smile evaporated. Her eyes widened, the color draining, until terror replaced beauty. She stepped back, her grip on his arm loosening as if his skin burned. Her mouth opened in a trembling gasp, and in a voice that quivered like glass about to shatter, she whispered words that detonated in the sterile air. "Oh my God, it's you!" Confusion tangled with dread. Who was she? Why would she look at me that way? What recognition could twist her expression into horror? I saw the smug curl falter on his lips for just a heartbeat, a flash of panic quickly masked, but enough to tell me he knew exactly why she reacted. I lay silent, my heart pounding, because in that suspended moment, I understood one truth more terrifying than shattered bones or months of solitude. Betrayal had only just begun, and the next revelation waiting in the shadows would break me more completely than the crash ever had. I was born into a house where silence carried more weight than words, and glances across the dinner table cut sharper than knives. My earliest memories are not of lullabies or bedtime stories, but of my father pacing the hallway, his shadow spilling beneath the crack of my bedroom door, his voice clipped and impatient when he spoke at all. My mother died when I was 7, a sudden illness that tore her from me overnight, leaving me with a father who had no idea how to love, and a stepmother who seemed to view me as an intruder rather than a child. While other girls wore ribbons and laughed in kitchens that smelled of cookies, I sat at my desk, clutching crumpled worksheets, terrified of the sighs and sharp corrections from the woman who insisted I call her mother, though the word tasted bitter every time. My father remarried within a year of my mother's funeral, and from that moment forward, I felt like a guest in my own home. His new wife brought with her a son from a previous relationship, and my father, perhaps out of guilt or cowardice, poured every ounce of approval into that boy. He was the golden child praised for his smallest effort while I stood invisible. Birthdays passed with no cake for me, holidays turned into rituals where I watched gifts pile around others while my corner remained bare. My father's philosophy was blunt. Children should be grateful simply to exist. Affection was a luxury he could not afford. And yet, there was one person who refused to let me vanish. My grandmother, Margaret. My mother's mother stepped into the role with quiet ferocity. She would arrive unannounced with bags of groceries when the cupboards in my corner of the kitchen were bare. She would slip me books when my stepmother refused to buy them, and she would sit on the edge of my bed, brushing my hair while whispering words that became my lifeline. "Family is actions, not blood." She repeated it so often it etched itself into my bones. She taught me that loyalty is proven in the small moments when no one is watching, that love is measured not in promises, but in presence. In her cramped living room, I felt what home should feel, like the scent of chamomile tea and old paper, the warmth of her hand on mine. It was Margaret who celebrated my report cards with pride, who hung my drawings on her refrigerator, who reminded me that I mattered. Yet even as she nurtured me, shadows crept at the edges. I overheard fragments of conversations, whispers about my father's absences, rumors that he had another family in another part of the city. I dismissed them as gossip until one day I found a photograph half hidden in a drawer at Margaret's house. It showed my father younger standing beside a woman I had never seen his arm loosely around her shoulders. In her arms was a baby wrapped in a pink blanket. When I asked Margaret, she stiffened, her eyes clouding before she tucked the photo away and told me some questions bring only pain. I never pressed again, but the image haunted me. Perhaps that was why when I turned 18, I fled. I poured myself into my studies, earning a place in architecture school, determined to carve a future defined not by neglect, but by creation. I rented a tiny apartment with peeling paint and broken locks, surviving on ramen and part-time shifts, but every time I laid out blueprints, I felt power I had never known. Still, family lingered at the edges like a wound that refused to heal. My father never called, never visited, not even when I graduated with honors. My stepmother sent a single email, brief and cold, "Congratulations. Do not expect financial support." It was Margaret again who beamed with pride, who pressed a small envelope into my hand with trembling fingers. Inside was a modest check, the last of her savings, along with a note in her looping handwriting. "Build something they cannot destroy." Those words lit a fire that carried me through sleepless nights drafting designs in cramped studios. But life has a way of circling back. Years later, when Margaret's health began to fail, I found myself once again sitting at her bedside, holding the hand that had always held mine. She looked at me with eyes still sharp despite her frail body and said, "Promise me you will never let them take what is rightfully yours." At the time, I thought she meant my dignity, my career, my self-worth. I did not know she also meant her house, her estate, the inheritance she would leave to me. Nor did I understand that my father's old secrets would come roaring back in the form of a half-sister. I never knew a woman who would one day stand in my hospital room, gripping the arm of my husband. For now, all I knew was that love had been scarce, betrayal common, and abandonment my oldest companion. I carried that weight into adulthood like a scar hidden beneath clothing, convincing myself I could outbuild the past, not realizing that foundations cracked in childhood have a way of resurfacing when you least expect. I met Eric in a place that should have been safe, a space filled with light and ideas, not shadows. It was my second year working at a Chicago design firm, a small studio that specialized in reimagining old brownstones. I loved tracing the bones of history with fresh lines of possibility, imagining how broken walls could become whole again, perhaps because I secretly wished the same for myself. Eric arrived one morning as a consultant introduced with fanfare by my boss. He was a structural engineer, tall and broad-shouldered, with an easy smile that disarmed everyone in the room. His voice was smooth, his humor quick, and when his gaze lingered on me across the drafting table, I felt seen in a way I had not felt in years. He asked thoughtful questions about my designs, told me I had a rare gift for blending strength and elegance. Compliments like that fell into the cracks of my insecurities and bloomed like wildflowers. He invited me to coffee under the pretext of discussing a project, and that coffee became dinner, then late-night walks along the river where city lights reflected like promises on the water. He told me he admired my resilience, that he could see how hard I had fought to become independent, and I let myself believe he understood me. For a girl who grew up starving for affirmation, his attention felt like salvation. Within a year, we were married in a modest ceremony. No frills, just vows spoken beneath the vaulted ceiling of an old church Margaret had loved. I remember looking at him as I said, "I do," feeling like I was finally chosen, finally worthy of devotion. For a while, the illusion held. Our first apartment was cramped but filled with laughter dinners on the floor because we could not afford a dining table, late nights sketching together as he scribbled calculations on napkins. I told myself this was what family felt like, two people building something side by side. But cracks appeared quickly, hairline fractures I tried to ignore. Eric insisted on handling our finances, saying numbers stressed me and he would protect me from that burden. At first it seemed gallant, but soon I realized I had no access to accounts, no knowledge of where the money went. He began staying out late, claiming networking events or last-minute site inspections. I wanted to believe him, but receipts I found in his jacket told another story: expensive dinners, luxury stores, transactions that had nothing to do with engineering. Once I confronted him, trembling, holding the receipts like proof of a crime, but he laughed, kissed my forehead, said, "You worry too much, Olivia. Let me take care of things." He had a way of twisting concern into irrationality, and I started to doubt my own instincts. Margaret warned me her eyes clouded with worry when she saw me at Sunday lunches. She said, "Watch a man's actions, not his words." I wanted to defend him, wanted to show her she was wrong, that I had chosen well, but deep down I heard the echo of her caution. Still, I pushed it aside because I was desperate to make the marriage work. Divorce to me meant failure, abandonment repeating itself, and I refused to let that be my story. The truth I could not yet see was that Eric had chosen me not for love, but for opportunity. He studied my background, learned about Margaret, understood I was the sole heir to a woman who owned property in prime Chicago neighborhoods. To him, I was not a partner, but an investment one he intended to control until the return was substantial. The more I surrendered, the more he expanded his dominance. He pressured me to sign documents I barely glanced at, promising they were routine. He berated me subtly, cloaked in charm, making me feel small when I questioned him. He isolated me from colleagues, saying they envied me, whispering poison into my ear until I withdrew from friendships. What I mistook for devotion was control tightening like a vice. The turning point came when Margaret grew ill. Eric was attentive then, but not to her. He hovered around me, pressing questions about her estate, her house, the details of her will. I brushed him off, uncomfortable with the timing, but the glint in his eyes betrayed hunger rather than grief. It was the first time I truly shivered in his presence, a chill that whispered he was not who I believed. Still, when she passed and I collapsed into his arms, he held me and I clung to him because I could not face the world alone. I did not know that in clinging I was handing him the very power he would use to nearly destroy me. When Margaret passed away, the world tilted on its axis. I had braced myself for grief, but nothing could prepare me for the silence of her empty house. The teacups still lined neatly in her cabinet, the faint scent of lavender lingering on her pillow. She had been my anchor, my proof that love existed, and when she was gone, I felt adrift in a sea of loss. But alongside the grief came a revelation that would ignite everything to come. At the reading of her will, the lawyer cleared his throat and in careful words declared that Margaret had left everything to me. Not only the house I had spent my childhood hiding within its brick walls weathered, but strong, but also $5 million in liquid assets she had quietly saved across decades. My breath caught the weight of her faith pressing on my shoulders. She had trusted me to carry her legacy forward, to use her life's work as a foundation for my own. I was overwhelmed, tears sliding silently as I clutched the folder of documents. But Eric's reaction was not grief, not pride, not even surprise. It was hunger. His eyes lit with a spark I had only ever seen when he talked about lucrative contracts or winning a high-stakes gamble. He leaned in close as soon as the lawyer stepped away, his hand heavy on my shoulder, his voice low but sharp. "We should put this in both our names," he said, "a joint account shared deed for protection." I blinked, confused, still raw from loss. He smiled as though I were a child to be soothed. "It's safer that way. Couples don't keep secrets. We are one." But in that moment, his words chilled me, because what I heard was not unity, but ownership. Margaret's warning echoed in my head. Family is actions, not blood. And I realized Eric had never once sat by Margaret's bedside, never once offered to drive me to her appointments, never once lifted a hand when she needed help. He had only ever asked about her estate. That night, I sat alone in the house she left me, the documents spread before me. I traced the ink of her signature, feeling her presence, her trust. I whispered to her empty chair, "I will protect this, I promise." But outside the window, I saw Eric pacing on the phone, his voice sharp, his laughter dark, and I knew he was already weaving plans. I should have confronted him, should have locked everything down, but grief made me slow and love made me blind. He pressed me daily, sliding papers in front of me, telling me to sign. When I hesitated, he turned cold, his charm vanishing. "Do you not trust me, Olivia, after everything I have done for you?" The guilt sank into my chest, and for a time I nearly gave in. Nearly. What stopped me was a small envelope Margaret had left tucked inside a box of her journals. On it, she had written my name in her looping script. Inside was a single sentence: "Do not let anyone take what is rightfully yours." Her voice was louder than Eric's pressure, her love stronger than his manipulation. I folded the envelope and placed it in my purse, carrying it like a shield. I resolved to wait to watch to be careful. But Eric sensed resistance, and in his world resistance was betrayal. He smiled more, kissed me sweeter, pretended patience, but behind his eyes the hunger sharpened to desperation. I did not know it then, but the inheritance had become a line in the sand, and he was already planning how to erase me to get to it. The night of the crash began like any other. Yet in hindsight, every detail feels sharpened, edged with omen. Rain slicked the Chicago streets, turning asphalt into mirrors. I clutched Margaret's envelope in my purse as though her handwriting could shield me. I had left the lawyer's office after signing a stack of protective documents that finally placed her estate firmly under my name. No loopholes, no joint access. For the first time since her death, I felt a fragile sense of control, and I was eager to return home. Eager, perhaps, to share the news with Eric, even if my gut screamed caution. I never made it. I remember headlights blooming too fast in the intersection, the howl of brakes that never caught the screech of a truck tearing through a red light. The world folded in on itself, glass exploding like shrapnel metal crumpling around me. Pain detonated in my chest ribs, snapping like dry twigs, the steering wheel crushing me in an iron embrace. My last clear memory before blackness was the sound of rain mingling with the hiss of leaking gasoline, and a thought, sharp and fleeting, was this: an accident or something darker. When I woke, the world was white and sterile. Tubes snaked into my arms, machines pulsed beside me, every breath a ragged knife. Nurse Clara leaned over her kind eyes, veined with fatigue. "You are lucky," she whispered, though lucky was not how it felt. Weeks blurred into months. Surgeries carved into my body stitches, mapping my skin like cruel cartography. I learned to measure time by the squeak of nurses' shoes and the drip of IV bags. Each morning, I asked if Eric had come. Each morning, the answer was silence. No flowers, no notes, no familiar voice. At first, I rationalized, told myself work kept him away, told myself he was grieving too. But then Clara looked at me one evening, her lips pressed tight before she said softly, "Your husband signed a form and end-of-life order. He thought you would not make it. He wanted the machines stopped." My body went cold even as heat burned in my chest. He had not only abandoned me, he had tried to erase me. I demanded the form, demanded proof, but Clara only shook her head, eyes darting as if even speaking of it placed her in danger. Still I knew. Eric had wanted me gone, and perhaps the crash was no accident at all. Rumors reached me in whispers how the brakes on my car had failed, how mechanics found evidence of tampering. Detective Howard visited once, asking questions I was too weak to answer, his notebook filling with words that made my stomach churn. Tampered lines, fingerprints, suspicions. But suspicion was not survival. Survival meant enduring, and so I endured, clinging to the thought of Margaret's voice family is actions, not blood, repeating it like prayer. Yet even prayer faltered when nights grew too long and the door never opened for him. My husband, the man I had trusted, had written me off as already dead. The truth did not break me all at once. It was slow, like frost creeping through cracks, until I realized I was utterly alone. The only constant was betrayal, and it was carving me as surely as the surgeon's knives. I thought I had already suffered the worst. I thought being abandoned in that hospital bed was the final cruelty. I had no idea what awaited me when the door finally opened and Eric returned not alone, but with a woman whose face would unravel the last illusions I clung to. The day Eric finally appeared should have been a moment of relief, a crack of light after endless darkness. But instead, it became the cruelest confirmation of everything I feared. The hospital room was dim curtains drawn against the pale winter sun, the machines humming their endless chorus beside my bed. I heard footsteps in the hall, firm and unhurried, and my heart leapt in spite of myself. Weeks, months had passed without a single visit. Perhaps I thought he had finally come to hold my hand to explain. But when the door opened, the truth walked in. Eric filled the doorway, his suit, pressed his hair, slicked back his shoes, polished to a mirror shine. He looked like a man heading to a celebration, not visiting his broken wife. And on his arm clung a woman I had never seen. Young, elegant, with auburn hair cascading over her shoulders and a silk scarf wound delicately around her neck. She carried the scent of roses and expensive perfume, a fragrance that swallowed the sterile air of antiseptic. They looked like a couple arriving at a gala, not entering the room where I struggled for each breath. My lips parted to whisper his name, but before I could, he raised his chin and spoke in a tone devoid of affection. "This is my wife now." The words slammed into me harder than the truck that shattered my body. I froze, unable to process. My throat constricted, the machines seemed to beep louder, mocking the silence that stretched between us. My heart pounded against fractured ribs, each beat a scream. But then something shifted. The young woman, this Vanessa, turned her gaze fully toward me, and in an instant, the confident smile drained from her lips. Her eyes widened, her hand trembled as it slipped from Eric's arm. She stepped back as though she had seen a ghost. Her mouth opened a whisper, trembling into the cold air. "Oh my God, you are Olivia Carter." The way she said my name was not casual recognition. It was horror disbelief, as if I were more than a headline or a forgotten wife. I tilted my head, confusion tightening inside me. "Yes!" I rasped, my voice raw. "Who are you?" She shook her head as if denying the truth, her eyes screamed. Eric snapped his hand, gripping her arm, his voice sharp with warning. "Enough, Vanessa!" He pulled her closer, but her eyes never left mine. It was then, in that suspended second, that realization flickered. I knew those eyes not from memory, but from reflection, echoes of whispers I had overheard as a child. Rumors of my father's absences of another woman, another child. The photograph I once found in Margaret's drawer, a baby wrapped in a pink blanket. My heart stuttered. No, it could not be. Yet Vanessa's trembling lips confirmed it. "I am your sister, half-sister. Your father was my father too." The words detonated inside me louder than any explosion, shaking the foundation of everything I thought I knew. I stared at her, blood roaring in my ears, the hospital walls spinning. Betrayal had multiplied, layered itself like a trap I never saw coming. My husband had not just replaced me, he had paraded into my hospital room with my own half-sister on his arm, using her as both weapon and prize. Eric smirked, his arrogance seeping through. Surprised? He always did keep secrets, didn't he? I wanted to scream, to tear the IV from my arm, to strike him with the fury that surged through my veins, but I lay trapped, my body broken, my voice shaking. Vanessa's horror deepened as she pulled her arm free from him. "You never told me she was my sister," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You said she was just some woman who couldn't move on, who was clinging to you." Eric's mask slipped for a heartbeat, irritation twisting his features before he forced the smirk back. "Details," he said coldly. "Family is irrelevant when money is on the table." Money. That was it, my inheritance. Margaret's house, her savings, everything she had left me. Eric had not only abandoned me, he had conspired to erase me, to steal what was mine, dragging Vanessa into his scheme. But in his arrogance, he had underestimated two things: the loyalty of a sister who had just discovered blood ties and the resilience of a woman who had already survived betrayal once. As I watched Vanessa step back from him, her eyes torn between disbelief and fury, I realized the tide had begun to shift. Betrayal had brought me to the edge of despair, but it had also handed me a weapon I never expected. I was not alone anymore. The sister I never knew had just become the crack in his armor, and through that crack I would make sure justice finally broke him. The moment Vanessa whispered the word sister, the balance in the room shifted. Eric dragged her out before I could ask questions, but her expression lingered with me, wide-eyed, stricken, betrayed. For days, I lay in the hospital replaying it all, every rumor from my childhood, every half-heard conversation about my father's absences, every shadow that hinted he had another family. Now the proof had walked into my room on Eric's arm. The betrayal was layered, not just abandonment by my husband, but exploitation of bloodlines I never knew existed. The pain in my ribs was nothing compared to the fire in my chest. I would not be erased. I began to plan. My first call was to Melanie, my oldest friend, the one who had stood by me when Margaret died. She rushed to my side, her eyes brimming with fury when I told her what Eric had done. "You can't fight him alone," she said, gripping my hand. "He will bury you in lies if you don't get ahead of him." Together, we contacted Benjamin Ross, a lawyer known for dismantling fraud cases with surgical precision. When he arrived, tall, severe briefcase snapping open like a weapon, I felt the first flicker of control return. I laid out everything: the inheritance, the crash, the signed end-of-life order, the sudden marriage. Benjamin's brow furrowed deeper with each detail. He said bluntly, "If what you say is true, this is more than abandonment. This is attempted murder and financial fraud. We need evidence." Evidence became my lifeline. Melanie dug through storage boxes in my apartment, finding receipts Eric had hidden, statements showing transfers of large sums to casinos and offshore accounts. She photographed everything, sending them to Benjamin. Nurse Clara, quiet but courageous, slipped into my room late at night with a copy of the form Eric had signed, his scrawled signature authorizing the machines to be turned off. She whispered, "I could lose my job for this, but you deserve the truth." I clasped her hand, tears burning, promising I would protect her when this reached court. Detective Howard returned as well, following up on the crash. He told me the mechanics had confirmed brake lines were cut deliberately. We matched fingerprints lifted from the car with Eric's, the prints smeared on the hood where he had lifted it days before. Howard's voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed disgust. "He meant for you not to survive." Each piece of evidence added a brick to the wall I was building against him. Still, one piece was missing: Vanessa. She had been drawn into Eric's orbit, manipulated into marriage, kept ignorant of the blood tie between us until she saw my face. She carried answers I needed. With Melanie's help, I arranged a meeting in secret. Vanessa arrived at the hospital after hours, her scarf pulled tight around her face as if hiding from the world. When she stepped into my room, her hands shook. I asked quietly, "Did you know?" She shook her head fiercely. "He told me you were unstable, obsessed with him, that you had squandered your grandmother's money and were trying to ruin us." I laughed bitterly, the sound raw. "That money was mine, and he has been spending it on everything but us." I slid a folder across the tray table, copies of the bank statements Melanie uncovered. Vanessa's eyes darted over the numbers, her lips parting in shock. "He told me these accounts were from his firm," she whispered. "He said he was saving for our future." Our future. The words cut, but I pressed on. "Vanessa, we share a father. That makes us sisters. He is using both of us, and if you stand with him, you stand against your own blood." She looked at me, tears welling, the war inside her visible. For the first time, I saw not the elegant stranger who entered with him, but a lost woman caught in his snare, just as I once was. I told her family is not blood alone, it is who shows up when you are broken. I am here despite everything. Can you say the same for him? Silence filled the room, thick and trembling. Finally, she nodded once, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. She whispered, "I will help you." Over the next days, she provided details only she could know, conversations overheard, documents Eric kept in a safe, even recordings on her phone of him boasting about how he would control Margaret's estate once I was gone. Benjamin listened to them, a slow smile curling as he said, "This is what will end him." I felt strength building, not physical, but deeper, the kind forged in betrayal and tempered in resolve. Eric thought he had broken me. Instead, he had handed me an army, a loyal friend, a fearless lawyer, a nurse who risked her career, a detective who wanted justice, and a sister who had finally seen the truth. Piece by piece, the trap was closing around him, and soon it would snap shut in the only place arrogance cannot survive: the courtroom. The courthouse smelled of old wood and dust, sunlight slanting through high windows onto polished floors that had borne the weight of countless reckonings. I had not walked more than a few yards without pain in months. But that morning I forced myself upright, my ribs bound, my steps measured, because I would not face him from a wheelchair. Melanie steadied me on one side, Benjamin on the other, and as we entered the courtroom, I felt the collective gaze of strangers fix on me, whispers rising. Isn't that the woman who was declared dead, the wife who survived? At the front, Eric stood smug in a tailored suit, Vanessa at his side. Or so he thought. He had no idea she had already chosen truth. When his eyes met mine, surprise flickered only for a second before arrogance returned. He smirked as though this was merely another performance he would win. The judge called order, the proceedings began, and Eric's attorney launched into a speech dripping with false concern. He painted me as unstable, fragile, incapable of handling finances, claiming Eric had stepped in out of necessity to preserve Margaret's estate. I sat silent, letting him weave his net of lies, because Benjamin had told me the key to victory was timing. When Eric took the stand, his voice was smooth, his answers rehearsed. He denied knowledge of the crash, denied tampering with my car, denied signing the end-of-life order. He insisted he loved me once, but I had grown paranoid obsessed, and that he had moved on only because I refused to accept reality. I clenched my fists under the table, fury pressing against my ribs. The judge turned to Benjamin. "Your witness." Benjamin rose, his steps deliberate. He began with simple questions, financial accounts, dates of transactions. Eric answered easily, his smirk growing with each word. Then Benjamin slid a folder onto the evidence table. Exhibits A through F, Your Honor. Copies of joint accounts drained into casinos' transfers to offshore banks, all tied to Mr. Carter. Eric's smile faltered, but he recovered quickly, claiming they were business expenses. Benjamin pressed on. "And what of this Exhibit G, the end-of-life form signed by you authorizing withdrawal of life support?" The courtroom stirred. Eric's attorney objected, but the judge allowed it. Eric shifted, sweat prickling his forehead. He stammered about misunderstanding, about being misled by doctors. Clara, summoned to the stand, shattered his excuse. She testified with quiet conviction that Eric had insisted I would not recover, that he pushed for the machines to be turned off. Her words cut deeper than any blade. Eric's mask cracked. The room felt electric tension coiled. Then Benjamin called Vanessa. Eric's head whipped toward her, confusion flashing. She rose slowly, walked to the stand, her eyes fixed on him with a mix of sorrow and fury. When Benjamin asked her to identify her relationship, she spoke clearly. "I am his wife," she said, then paused, turning her gaze to me. "And I am her half-sister." Gasps erupted. The judge hammered for silence. Eric's face, drained of color rage, igniting in his eyes. Vanessa continued, her voice trembling but strong. "He lied to me about who she was, about who I was. He told me Olivia was unstable, that she was wasting money. He used me to get closer to her inheritance. But I saw the truth. I saw the bank records. I heard him boasting that once she was gone, everything would belong to him." She held up her phone, a recording playing Eric's voice, smug, cruel. "She'll never walk out of that hospital, and when the machines are off, I'll have it all." The words echoed like a death knell. Eric lunged to his feet, shouting, "That recording is fake. She's lying. They're all lying." Officers stepped forward, restraining him as the judge demanded order. Benjamin delivered the final blow, presenting the mechanic's report and Howard's testimony confirming the brake lines had been cut, fingerprints smeared across the hood belonging to Eric. It was over. The judge's gavel struck like thunder. "Mr. Carter, you stand accused of attempted murder, fraud, and forgery. You will be remanded into custody pending trial." The officers moved in, handcuffs clinking. Eric thrashed his eyes, locking on me with venom. "You think you've won, Olivia." But as they dragged him away, I felt no fear, only release. I looked at Vanessa, tears streaking her cheeks, and for the first time I saw not betrayal, but the fragile beginnings of family. She stepped from the stand, crossing the room, and when she reached me, she whispered, "I am sorry." I nodded, too choked to speak. The judge adjourned, the crowd dispersed, but the sound of justice remained ringing in my ears, louder than any machine that once kept me alive. I walked out of that courtroom not just as a survivor, but as someone who had finally reclaimed her voice. The courthouse emptied, but the echoes of Eric's fury lingered long after he was dragged away in handcuffs. I stood outside the steps with Benjamin, Melanie, and Vanessa, the cold air biting at my cheeks. Yet for the first time in months, I felt warmth in my chest. The headlines spread within hours. Local news stations ran with the story of the wife declared dead, the inheritance scheme, the husband arrested mid-trial. Cameras flashed, microphones pressed forward, but Benjamin shielded me, his hand raised firmly. No comment, he said, guiding me through the crowd. Still, the story grew, rippling through newspapers, radio, social media. Strangers began to recognize me not as a victim, but as a survivor. But survival was only the beginning. The trial moved quickly. The weight of evidence was crushing the forged end-of-life form, the recordings Vanessa provided, the bank statements, the mechanic's report, tying Eric's fingerprints to the tampered brake lines. Prosecutors built their case with precision, and though Eric's defense tried every tactic, claiming coercion, blaming stress, insisting recordings were doctored, the truth was unshakable. I sat through each session, my body aching from injuries, but my resolve anchored me. I watched him flail, watched the arrogance drain until he was merely a man, exposed, his lies scattered like ashes. When the verdict came, the courtroom held its breath. Guilty on all counts, attempted murder, fraud, forgery. The judge's voice was steady, final. 18 years in prison. The gavel fell, and with it the last tether that bound me to him snapped. Eric's face twisted as the sentence was read. He tried to lunge again, shouting my name, but the bailiffs restrained him. I did not flinch. For once, I looked at him with nothing. No love, no fear, no hatred. Only emptiness, the hollow where he once resided now cleared for something better. Vanessa sat beside me, her hand slipping into mine. We had been strangers days earlier, yet in that moment the bond of shared betrayal tied us tighter than years of acquaintance ever could. She wept quietly, whispering, "I should have seen it. I should have known." I squeezed her hand. "He lied to both of us," I said softly. "You are not his crime." The reporters followed every step of the fallout. Articles exposed his gambling debts, his offshore accounts, the mistresses who came forward with their stories. His reputation crumbled, his firm collapsed, his name became synonymous with greed and cruelty. Meanwhile, I reclaimed what was mine. Margaret's house, once under threat, now stood untouched, its bricks holding steady against the storm. The inheritance remained intact, safeguarded by Benjamin's legal maneuvers. For the first time since the crash, I could breathe knowing it was secure. The police honored Nurse Clara for her courage, recognizing the risk she had taken by preserving documents. Detective Howard received commendation for pursuing the case with persistence. Justice had not only served me, it had acknowledged everyone who stood with me when I was broken. Yet justice was not just about punishment. It was about reclaiming boundaries. I closed the accounts Eric had drained, cut ties with his associates, and refused to let his shadow linger. When his family tried to contact me, pleading leniency, I gave them silence. He had chosen his path. He would walk it alone. The house became my refuge. Melanie helped me move back in unpacking boxes, filling the kitchen with laughter that had been absent for too long. Vanessa visited, often shy at first, then with growing confidence, helping repaint rooms, sharing stories of her childhood. We discovered pieces of our father in both of us, the tilt of a smile, the stubborn streak, but we agreed that blood had never made him family. What made us family now was choice, the decision to stand by each other when the world tried to break us. The final echo of justice came months later when restitution was ordered. Eric was required to repay what he had stolen, though I knew he never could. Still, the principle mattered. The court's acknowledgement was a seal, a recognition that what had been done to me was not just cruel, but criminal. When I walked out of that hearing, I inhaled the spring air and realized justice was not a thunderclap, but a series of steady beats, like the return of a strong, unbroken heart. I was no longer the woman left in a hospital bed abandoned. I was no longer the wife erased. I was Olivia Carter, heir to Margaret's strength, survivor of betrayal, and architect not just of buildings but of my own rebirth. Healing did not arrive with the sound of a gavel or the clink of handcuffs. It arrived slowly, hesitantly, like sunlight creeping through broken blinds after a storm. My body bore the map of pain scars stitched across my skin, ribs still aching when I moved too quickly, but it was my heart that needed the longest time. The house Margaret left me became both sanctuary and challenge. its walls whispered with memory corners filled with her absence, yet also with her love. I decided to honor her the only way I knew how, by filling the rooms with life again. Melanie moved in for the first few months, her laughter ricocheting off the high ceilings as we painted walls and unpacked boxes. At night, we sat by the fireplace with mugs of tea, and she reminded me daily that I was more than what he tried to erase. She became not just a friend, but a sister by choice. Proof of Margaret's words, family is actions, not blood. Vanessa came cautiously at first, guilt clinging to her like a second skin. She hovered at the threshold, uncertain if she had the right to step into my world after standing at Eric's side. But I welcomed her because I saw not betrayal, but survival. She, too, had been deceived, manipulated, used as a pawn. Slowly, she let her guard down. Together, we repainted the guest room, choosing a shade of soft green Margaret once loved. As the brushstrokes layered over old plaster, so too did trust begin to layer between us. We shared stories, hers of a childhood raised in the shadow of a father who came and went, mine of growing up invisible in my own home. We realized the absence of his love had shaped us both, two daughters scarred by the same man, now finally choosing to stand as sisters, not by his blood, but by our own choice. Vanessa cried the day she admitted she had once believed Eric when he told her I was unstable. I held her hand, telling her we had both been victims, but now we were survivors together. Benjamin visited often, advising me as I set up legal safeguards to ensure no one could ever threaten the inheritance again. But he also became more than a lawyer. His calm presence, his respect, his quiet humor stitched itself into my life until he felt like family too. One evening, as the sun dipped over Chicago and painted the walls gold, he suggested something I had not dared imagine. Use the money not just to survive, but to build. Margaret's Foundation, he said. A place for women who had faced betrayal, financial abuse, coercion. The idea took root instantly. Within months, the paperwork was filed, the house became headquarters, and what was once a symbol of secrecy and inheritance transformed into a beacon of resilience. Survivors walked through its doors and found hope the same way I once clutched Margaret's hand and found courage. Healing was not linear. There were nights I woke screaming, the sound of screeching brakes echoing in my ears. There were mornings I reached instinctively for a man who was no longer there, then remembered the truth with a stab of shame. But each time I rose because I was no longer alone. Around me stood chosen family, Melanie, Vanessa, Benjamin, even Clara and Howard, who checked in reminding me I mattered. Together they filled the hollow Eric had left. Family, I realized, was never about who claimed you by name, but who claimed you by action, and I had finally found mine. A year later, the house no longer felt like a mausoleum of grief. Its windows glowed with warm light. Its halls echoed with footsteps that belonged not to ghosts, but to the living. The Margaret Foundation had officially opened its doors, and on the morning of the dedication ceremony, I stood on the balcony overlooking the small garden she once tended, dressed in a simple navy dress, a silver locket at my throat that once belonged to her. The world had shifted in ways I could never have imagined when I first woke broken in that hospital bed. Survivors sat in the audience, women who had endured abandonment, betrayal, financial violence, each of them carrying their own scars, each of them standing taller now because they knew they were not alone. Vanessa stood beside me, her hand firm in mine. No longer the frightened stranger Eric had paraded into my room, but my sister by choice and by truth. She had cut ties with the shadows of our father, choosing instead to build something brighter with me. Together, we had designed the Foundation's programs, legal aid counseling workshops to teach financial independence. We had transformed pain into architecture of hope. Melanie hovered close, her laughter still my lifeline, while Benjamin spoke briefly about the importance of resilience, his words measured but full of pride. When my turn came, I stepped to the podium, my heart hammering as eyes fixed on me. I breathed once, steadying, and then I spoke. I told them about Margaret's words, how she taught me that family is actions, not blood. I told them about betrayal, about being left for dead, about the night my husband declared me gone. I told them about the crash, the courtroom, the sentence that had closed one chapter but opened another. And then I told them the truth that mattered most, that survival is not the end, it is the beginning. That healing is not about erasing scars, but about wearing them as proof you endured. That legacy is not money or houses, but the love you build and pass forward. My voice shook but grew stronger with each word until the room was silent, the kind of silence heavy with understanding. When I finished, applause swelled not polite but fierce like a tide rising. Tears blurred my vision, but I smiled because this was what Margaret wanted. This was what she meant when she pressed the envelope into my hand and told me not to let anyone take what was mine. I had thought she meant the house, the inheritance, but now I understood she meant my dignity, my right to live fully, my ability to choose who my family would be. After the ceremony, Vanessa and I walked the garden paths, the scent of roses lingering in the air. She stopped by a plaque newly placed at the center engraved with Margaret's name. Family is actions, not blood. She traced the letters with her finger, then turned to me. You kept her promise, she whispered. We kept it, I corrected. As the sun set, painting the sky in streaks of orange and gold, I felt peace settle over me. Eric sat behind bars, forgotten his name buried under the weight of his crimes. He had tried to take everything, but in the end, he had given me clarity. From abandonment, I found loyalty from betrayal. I found truth from loss. I built legacy. The cycle had broken. I was no longer the girl who sat invisible at her father's table, no longer the wife erased in a hospital bed. I was Olivia Carter, survivor, sister, builder, keeper of a legacy not of money, but of strength. And as the evening breeze carried the sound of laughter from inside the house, I realized the final truth. Justice is not just a verdict, it is the life you live after, and mine was only beginning.